Thank you very much for letting us.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Patricia Parker. I'm director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities here in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I want to thank you for joining us for the Mary Stevens Reckford Memorial Lecture in European Studies. I greet you on behalf of Dean Jim White, Dean of the College, who unfortunately could not be here today, but thank you to Senior Associate Dean Elizabeth Engelhardt for representing the college. Also bringing you greetings on behalf of John Stevens, who is the director of the Center for European Studies, which is a co-sponsor for this event, and Priscilla Lane, the incoming director of the center, also sends her greetings. We are extremely pleased to offer this lecture annually as a central part of the Institute's commitment to public humanities. Indeed, when it was established in 1990 by Dr. Kenneth J. Reckford, the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Classics, to honor his late wife, Mary, the charge was to appeal to the public rather than specialists. Speakers in European studies are asked to provide an interdisciplinary approach and a sense of shared humanity. This year's speaker, Ana Araujo, whom I will introduce in a moment, does just that with her focus on the legacies of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Her scholarship argues that struggles over memories of slavery are not just about coming to terms with society's past histories with enslavement. Rather, they are defined by their present association with the persistent issues of systemic injustices that remain ingrained in the fabric of countries and societies where slavery existed. The current public discourses about what histories can and or cannot be taught reminds us of our charge in the arts and humanities. We need to provide tools and framing for discerning what it looks like when our shared humanity is flourishing or threatened. Dr. King named this when he said in 1963, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." I think Dr. Araujo's work gives us analytical tools for seeing how various forms and sites of memory can be revelatory of what Dr. King called our inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. I will say one last thing about how this year's Reckford Lecture is central to our commitment to the public humanities. Dr. Araujo's lecture is part of several events at UNC Chapel Hill that amplify the centrality and urgency of the study of slavery. Last evening, the Sonia Haynes Stone Center hosted the Jenna Ray McNeil Endowed Black History Month lecture featuring Harvard historian Vincent Brown. Brown's book, Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War, tells the story of a significant uprising of enslaved Africans in Jamaica in 1760. And like our speaker today, drives home the point that the history of slavery is global history. And on March 15th through the 19th of this year, just in a month or so, the university's Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward, which I co-chair, will be hosting the International Consortium of the University Studying Slavery. That spring conference will be on our campus in Chapel Hill in March. So I hope you will be able to join us for that, and you can look at go to the website, UNC website, to find more details. So now let me acknowledge some of our special guests, and then bring forward Dr. Araujo. First, I'd like to acknowledge Lisa Lindsay, Dr. Lisa Lindsay, who is a professor and chair in the history department, and she does similar work to that of Dr. Araujo. She is here along with some of her students from her Atlantic Slave Trade undergraduate course. So, Lisa, where are you? Thank you for being here. And to the students, perhaps you saw at check-in that this you can get credit for this for your course. So this is a campus life experience. So if you haven't done so, please check with one of the staff members. I also would like to acknowledge Professor Jim Malutis. Jim is the Peter T. Grauer Associate Dean of the Honors College, a professor of history, the director of the James M. Johnston Center for Undergraduate Excellence, and he is the other co-chair of the Commission on History, Race, and Way Forward. So we co-chair that commission together, and it's my great honor to do that work with Jim Malutis. And finally, I want to give a special welcome to, I think I can say this, my friends and very special guests, Joe and Chalme Reckford. Thank you so much for being here today and for your support. Joe is the son of Kenneth and Mary Reckford, for whom this lecture is named. The Institute holds this lecture during February to mark and celebrate Mary's birthday, which is on February 25th. So happy birthday to, in honor of Mary Reckford. And now, for the speaker of the hour. Dr. Araujo is an American social and cultural historian and a history professor at Howard University. Her work explores the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and their present-day legacies, including the long history of demands of reparations for slavery and colonialism. She has a particular interest in the memory, heritage, and visual culture of slavery. Dr. Araujo and her work have been recognized around the country and around the world. Last year, she was awarded the prestigious Getty Residential Senior Scholar Grant, where she is currently in fellowship at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society of London and a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. Dr. Araujo has authored and edited over 13 books and published more than 50 articles and chapters on the history of slavery and its legacies. She has 2 new books under contract. One is called The Gift, How Objects of Prestige Shaped the Atlantic Slave Trade and Colonialism, and that's being published by Cambridge. And then the other is Humans in Shackles, an Atlantic History of Slavery in the Americas with the University of Chicago Press. So it's just been such a pleasure getting to know this brilliant scholar and public intellectual. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ana Lucia Araujo.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Professor Parker, for inviting me to deliver the 2023 Mary Stevens Reckford Lecture in European Studies. Never in history has slavery been so debated in public circles. Of course, this interest is not new. The past few decades already seen a growing attention being paid to the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. An avalanche of commemoration since the 1990s led to the construction of monuments and memorials remembering the victims of the Atlantic slave trade in various countries of the Americas, also in Africa and in Europe. The approach of 2007, the bicentennial of the British abolition of the slave trade, also propelled the creation of museums and a huge wave of conferences, as well as new books and documentary films, focusing on the British participation in the trade of enslaved Africans. Motion pictures then, like Amazing Grace, praise the role of women Wilberforce in fighting against the British Atlantic slave trade. In 2012, years before the commemoration of the 60th centennial of the abolition of the slavery in the United States, the film Lincoln was released and directed then by Steven Spielberg, who already had directed in 1997 the film Amistad, telling the history of the Amistad slave rebellion. Like Amazing Grace, the movie Lincoln featured then President Abraham Lincoln of the United States as the great emancipator. Now, in the United States, new movies and television series started focusing on the lives of specific historical characters who were enslaved in the Americas. A film like 12 Years a Slave, 2014, featuring the story of Solomon Northup, a black man born free in the state of New York, but kidnapped in Washington, D.C. and sold into slavery. The movie won several Academy Awards in 2014, including the one of Best Picture. And the movie also, more recently, the movie The Birth of a Nation, 2016, brought to the big screen the bloody slave revolt led by Nat Turner in Southampton, in Virginia, in 1831. And it was not the only one, indeed. Released in 2019, the motion picture Harriet presented the story of Harriet Tubman, the enslaved woman who escaped slavery in the middle of the 19th century and helped many other enslaved men, women, and children to escape to freedom. The production of these movies responded to the demands of popular audiences who were tired of seeing the history of slavery presented through the lens of European and American men, represented as heroes who abolished the slavery and the slave trade. Then, starting in 2013, the persistent violence against black men and women gave rise to Black Lives Matter as a global movement. In the next years, a growing number of citizens, most of them persons who are racialized as black, took the public space to demand the removal of monuments commemorating white men who defended slavery. In Brazil, the slavery past has been present in the public sphere through religious and public festivals such as Carnival. We just had Carnival in Brazil, which remains a black festival. And these ceremonies and religious festivals existed, and of course during the period of slavery and also until the abolition of the slavery in Brazil in 1888. But despite this visibility, it's only in recent years in Brazil that federal, state, and municipal governments started investing in permanent markers commemorating the country's history of slavery. Yet, like in the United States, since the 1980s, Brazil also witnessed a growing number of cultural productions focusing on the history of the country's slavery. These movies, for example, and you have here, such as Quilombo, directed by Cacajegues in 1984, tells the history of Palmares Quilombo, the largest and long-lasting Brazilian runaway slave community. In the past few years, several comic books have also told the story of these estates created by enslaved, freed, and free black individuals born in Brazil and Africa to resist slavery in the 17th century. Recently, African-American novelist Gail Jones published her epic novel, Palmares, also drawing from on the history of Brazil's Quilombo. Then these new cultural productions addressing the history of slavery were not dissociated from the growing number of academic studies exploring many dimensions of the lives of enslaved people in the Americas. Some of these works focused, for example, on specific biographies on how Bond's people resisted against slavery. Still, the work of most historians of slavery remained perhaps too specific and thereby confined to academic circles. But as slavery became a topic of growing dissent in the public sphere, this landscape that has been changing since the 1990s was dramatically altered in the past 5 years. Still during the Obama years, and we mentioned Black Lives Matter, the persisting violence against Black men and women that resulted in the murder of Black men such as Trayvon Martin and many others gave rise to Black Lives Matter. And gradually this movement developed a global reach. In March 2015, far away from here, protesters racialized as Black took the public space in South Africa to demand the removal of monuments commemorating Cecil Rhodes in a movement that became known, Rhodes Must Fall. In the United States, white supremacists, terrorists became increasingly radicalized. In June 2015, Dylann Roof murdered 9 African-American men and women at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. In response, protesters demanded the removal of, or in some cases they removed themselves, the Confederate flag that was still flying atop public buildings. 2 years later, in August 2017, as Nazi and white supremacists rallied to protect monuments honoring pro-slavery individuals such as Robert E. Lee, and even killed one counter-protester, Black and white citizens also demanded the removal of dozens of monuments honoring Confederate soldiers and generals who fought to maintain slavery in the United States. In some cases, they took the matters into their own hands, here in North Carolina, for example, by taking themselves down these monuments. Now, in 2019, this is a year that became an emblematic year for Black history. This year marks the 400th anniversary of 1619, the arrival of the first documented enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia. The year 1619 became associated with the birth of slavery in the United States. Yet, this date is also a construction. Indeed, since the 16th century, thousands of enslaved Africans have been brought to the Americas in general, including the Caribbean, Brazil, and the region encompassing today's United States. But despite this fact, the year 1619 became more than ever a landmark, a commemorative date that gained new visibility through the journalistic project led by Nicola Hannah-Jones and the New York Times, featuring essays by scholars, writers, and artists, focusing then on the present-day legacies of slavery in the United States. The emphasis on this specific year and the politicized reactions against the journalistic project triggered fierce public discussions in the media, social media as well. Some academics criticized the project's accuracy, whereas politicians instrumentalized the project by rejecting the centrality of slavery in the history of the United States. Other historians also criticized the project for centering too much on victimhood. But regardless of how political parties and individuals made use of these debates, and despite the fact that Africans have arrived in the Americas starting in the 16th century, the year 1619 that for decades had already been a site of memory for many African Americans, gained now new meanings and started being conceived as a reminder of how chattel slavery gave birth to anti-black racism, in a context in which the United States still failed to implement any national date to commemorate its tragic involvement in this human atrocity. Now, as the COVID pandemic hit the world, and following the assassination of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, anti-racist protests against police violence spread in the United States and in several countries in Europe, even in Latin America and Africa, leading them to the removal of many other monuments honoring slave traders and pro-slavery individuals. Eventually, in June 2021, after many years of discussion, Juneteenth National Independence Day was officially instated as a federal holiday commemorating the emancipation from slavery in the United States. The holiday is certainly an important achievement, paying homage then to formerly enslaved people and their descendants. But the battles over slavery, over the past associated with slavery, continue to evolve. Starting in 2020, several states in the United States introduced legislation banning books on the history of slavery and racism. As one can imagine, these prohibitions are not related to the history of slavery itself. They are rather attempts to control how the history of slavery is taught. They are also expressions of how the past is politicized in the present, as I already discussed in my previous work. And these battles, of course, are not about history or about the past. They are about memory and how specific groups, here organized along racial lines, engage the past in the present to fulfill the present-day political needs. Then, despite our overly emphasis on the United States, public and sometimes contentious exchanges about slavery were not unique to the United States and did not happen in isolation. Let me just grab some water. Let's go back in time now. Caribbean countries have been commemorating slavery in the public space since at least the 1960s through the construction of monuments honoring enslaved rebels such as Kufi in Guyana and Carlota in Cuba. In Mexico and Colombia, also we saw similar initiatives. The countries have honored enslaved insurgents such as Bioho and Yanga for many years as well. Starting in 1888, and for nearly 50 years indeed, Brazil has also observed May 13, the date of the abolition of slavery, as a national holiday. Although this holiday was suppressed in the 1930s, since the end of the Cold War, dozens of cities in Brazil have also adopted November 20th as the date of the death of Zumbi, the leader of Palmares, as a national day to celebrate Black consciousness. Then, during most of the past 2 decades, indeed, of the 21st century, successive Brazilian governments passed legislation and promoted initiatives to recognize the history of slavery and the country's long-lasting connections with the African continent. However, in recent years, fascist Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has claimed that the Portuguese never set foot in Africa, and therefore Brazil had no responsibility in the enslavement of Africans. Yes. Such positions show that, although the history of slavery and the whole of the country in the Atlantic slave trade has long been documented and established in numerous studies, at any time, publicly elected authorities can decide to make false claims about their country's history, which is why historians not only constantly have to revisit and re-illuminate the past, but also need to engage public debates that take place in the present. Like Brazil, for example, since 2006, France began commemorating its past involvement in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. On May 10, that is a national day commemorating the memories of the trade, slavery, and their abolition. In this climate, then, new debates about the need for reparations for slavery also re-emerged once again. This demand is re-emerged, for example, especially after 2014, when the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, an organization that comprising 15 member states, released a 10-point plan demanding European countries to make a formal apology and also to provide reparations for slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and colonialism. CARICOM's calls for redress was followed by heated discussions in the United States and European countries, showing then how slavery continued to be significant in our contemporary world. I have explored indeed in previous works the reasons why this new interest has re-emerged in recent years. Among others, I explain why and how the Atlantic slave trade and slavery are memorialized in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. I also have shown that this relevance has little to do with what happened in the past, but is rather related to how racism, as well as present-day social or racial inequalities, perpetuate the exclusion of people labeled as blacks in societies where chattel slavery existed. Now, because racism and white supremacy persist in Europe, Africa, and the Americas among the legacies of Atlantic slavery and colonialism, this long and painful past still matters. Now, even during the recent developments of the global pandemic, Black populations in Brazil and the United States were disproportionately affected by the health disparities raised by the pandemic, and also impacted by the lockdown measures that prevented Black and Brown populations in countries who depend on precarious jobs and on the informal economy to make their livelihoods. Then the impacts of these restrictions were even more prominent in the African continent. Of course, at the same time, all this excessive focus on the present can blur our ability to address the study of chattel slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and also colonialism with more clarity. Most of our understanding of what the Atlantic slave trade and the slavery were is framed by the lens of the global North Atlantic. It is Anglo-centric and shaped by a British and US perspective. Therefore, the artificial centrality of 1619. The persistent emphasis on the United States and the British colonies in the West Indies tends to obscure the real dimensions of the slavery and the slave trade in the Americas. Approximately 12 million Africans were brought to the Americas during the entire period of the Atlantic slave trade. And we have more than 3.4 million enslaved Africans who disembarked in the British and the French West Indies together, whereas approximately 400,000 enslaved persons embarked at African ports and came ashore in mainland North America. Now, in the case of Brazil, it's more than 4.8 million enslaved men, women, and children who landed on Brazilian shores. This is the largest number in the Americas and nearly 10 times more the number of enslaved Africans who were brought from the African continent to the United States. Also, Brazil was the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. Today, in part as a reflection then of this long history of the Atlantic slave trade in the country, Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside Nigeria. Then we can say that many histories have ignored, downplayed, erased the history of Africa and the role of enslaved women in men and women in the institution of slavery. As I engage history and memory in my work, I ask myself, what is our role as historians in telling the history of slavery? Why, either in Brazil or the United States, and even in Britain, journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones, like Howard French, or in Brazil, Laurentino Gomes, have been apparently so more successful than historians in telling histories of slavery? Why have we historians failed to respond to the calls of historians such as Marcus Reckford and Jennifer Morgan, who have challenged historians to write human histories of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade that center the experience, the lived experiences of enslaved men and women, and not demographics and economics? Why most historians ignore the invitations of historians such as Michael Gomez, Herman Bennett, Bobby Green, who have called historians of the Atlantic slave trade to embrace the long history of the African continent instead of engaging Africa as a mere repository of enslaved labor? Then perhaps the answer relies on the perceived differences between history and memory. Memory and history are different modes of discourse that engage the past. Yet, despite this artificial dimension, the artificial distinction between these two modes of discourse, we can try to establish a line separating both. Let's try to do that. Historical discourse is an imperfect account based on primary sources, such as a written document, a visual image, an object, or an oral account, produced in a specific moment of what is conventionally defined as being the past. Because we can argue about what is exactly the past. French historian Marc Bloch, for example, pointed out that the past is also a convention that is, and I quote, by definition, a given that nothing will change anymore, unquote. Even though the knowledge about the past is always in progress and is, quote, constantly changing and improving, unquote. Anthropologist Michel Houff-Trouillot underscored that, and I quote, history means both the facts of the matter and a narrative of those facts. Both happen and that which is said to have happened, unquote. Historians then not only aim to establish facts, they examine, they select, they classify, they organize, they interpret these facts in the light of existing evidence. Ultimately, then, normative history, the history that is produced by professional historians, this history that you as students, you learn in a history program, is an organized account that attempts to explain the past. Yet, as we know, historians rarely witness the events that they narrate, and very often they have no direct access to the social actors who witness the experiences they recount. Though it can happen that we do. For example, historians working on the history of the Holocaust is still today, increasingly not the case, but still, until recently could have access to men and women who survived the Holocaust. But historians of my generation never had the opportunity of interviewing a person who was formerly enslaved in Virginia or in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Then, despite these high aims that, of objectivity that historians have, and in many cases there are serious attempts to tell the truth, history written by historians is also biased. The late scholar David Lowenthal, who was not a historian, he was a geographer, has observed that historians are also aware, quote, they cannot avoid manipulating the evidence, unquote. Consequently, like memory, history, according to him, and I quote, conflates, exaggerates, abridges. What is crucial or unique is made to stand out, uniformities and minutiae fade away, unquote. Perhaps then French philosopher Paul Ricoeur conveys the most insightful dimension of the relation between history and memory. Ricoeur refuses the opposition between these two modes of discourse. He sees memory as the quote, and I quote him, as the womb of history, inasmuch as memory remains the guardian of the entire problem of the representative relation of the present to the past, unquote. Then, basically, memory of slavery in its different modalities that can be collective memory, cultural memory, public memory, engage the slavery past in the present, as I discussed in my recent book, Slavery in the Age of Memory. Now, slavery scholars in the United States took longer, I would say, than their French and British counterparts to engage the debates on memory of slavery. It's no news that many historians were caught by surprise when people started taking down the monuments, and many just at the last minute decided that they were qualified to discuss what was happening in the streets, even if they never had any interest in monuments and anything similar to monuments. But just a few months ago, dear historian James Sweet wrote a controversial, and he is the president of the American Historical Association, he wrote a controversial op-ed in which he lamented what he calls presentism. For the traditional historian, presentism and anachronism are the two biggest things to be avoided by historians. But what Sweet seems to have missed is that in many ways presentism is another term to refer to memory. French historian François Hartog in his book Régime de historicité, Présentisme et expérience du temps, that was translated in English as Regimes of Historicities, Presentism, and Experiences of Time. Hartog, he has argued that history is marked by the spirits when the relation to time is questioned. And because each society has its own forms of articulating the past, the present, and the future, Hartog's notion of historicity regime that relies to some extent on the French example, but he also studied antiquity in other works, then this notion of historicity regime can be extended indeed to other geographical areas. In other words, the notion of historicity regime can be an instrument to help us thinking about our contemporary world, and in this context, the presentist historicity regime is characterized indeed by this immediate obsolescence of all events and by the omnipresence of the present. Then some characteristics of this presentist regime, simultaneity, real-time media, numerical circulation, and torrents of memory. Also, another dimension of this regime is the commemoration and identities that gain big importance. Then, from this perspective, memory is no longer something that is associated with collective memory, that is, simply put, the transmission of an account from one generation or one group to another. Today, memory is public. It's public memory. It is an instrument allowing individuals and groups to assert a denied, lost, or suppressed identity in the present. And this is why the connection between memory of slavery and race and racism is important. Now, public memory is always politicized, and what Hartog calls presentist regime of historicity can be simply referred to as memory or public memory. Therefore, when what Sweet lamented in his op-ed at the time, what was lamenting was that history was being assaulted by memory. In particular, he lamented the assault of memory to the study of the history of slavery. Now, the question that remains is, can historians dissociate their work from the present time? In the case of slavery, how can historians separate the historical subjects they study from the present when the descendants of these same subjects remain alive with us and to a great extent still continue to be socially and economically excluded? What can then the approach of memory that centers the lived experience and also engage the past in the present, how this approach can help us to write the history of slavery? Then, if in previous works I studied the history of memory, in one of my current book projects, I used the approach of memory to engage the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. For several decades, existing general histories of slavery, documentary films, and even museum exhibitions telling the history of slavery have insisted on centering the British North Atlantic world, including North America, and the English-speaking Caribbean colonies. I seek then to redress these distortions and imbalances because these histories indeed have historically excluded the central role, for example, of Brazil in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, while also ignoring the history of Africa and the role of enslaved women in the institution of slavery. The persistent emphasis on the British colonies of North America and later the United States, as well as the British West Indies, tends indeed to obscure the real dimensions of the slavery and the slave trade in the Americas. And this is why it's important to remind that Brazil and indeed the Luso-Brazilian slave trade are central to understand the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas. Now today then, in part as a reflection of this long past that we already mentioned, that Brazil has this largest population of African descent, then the largest one in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, then, this is one of the consequences of this long history of the Atlantic slave trade to Brazil. On the other hand, the African continent and the dynamic of Atlantic exchanges that continue occurring with Africa, greatly contribute to shaping the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of the slavery in the Americas. But the role of Africa usually remains ignored in all that. Now, slavery in Latin America, for example, and including Brazil, was extremely violent, therefore as cruel as bondage in the United States and the British West Indies. And I know that perhaps many people here, they do not know that. They think that perhaps slavery that existed in Brazil and Latin America was somewhat softer. Enslaved women also, despite having been brought in smaller numbers than men to the Americas, they played a central role in the institution of the slavery, as it was through their wombs, indeed, that slave owners obtained new enslaved people. Then to start concluding, I would say that the way we write the history of slavery is full of imbalances and asymmetries, as the global north continued to be privileged. Either when writing history, teaching history courses, creating museum exhibitions, I call us to redress this imbalance and to use the work of memory to write history. I believe that through the approach of memory, we can engage the lived experiences of enslaved people, a dimension that very often remain absent from the work of traditional historians. Most histories of the slavery in the Americas also have privileged a national perspective, even though slavery and the Atlantic slave trade relied on transnational systems of exchange and competition. I also insist that to fully understand this history of these atrocities, we need to get rid of the national boundaries by looking beyond the United States and the Caribbean, and by fully incorporating Latin America, and especially Brazil, that was a crucial player in the continental and transoceanic history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Indeed, Brazil is inseparable from the African continent until at least the middle of the 19th century and beyond. As historians, we try to write and rewrite the long history of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas by often using traditional records, usually written records such as correspondences, pamphlets, travel accounts, wills, farm logbooks, census, marriage and birth records, but to write a history that also takes memory into account and engage the lives of men and women who very often did not leave written records behind, we should also pay attention to oral traditions, to music, to dance, and other bodily traditions. History and memory are, at the end of the day, two different modes of discourse that engage the past in different ways. Both modes of discourse can be politicized. But as we reckon with the past of the slavery and colonialism, and social actors, especially those racialized as blacks, brown, and indigenous, denounced their exclusion from existing historical narratives, and also from existing statues and public monuments and even museums. I believe that memory provides us historians a framework that takes into account the lived experiences of men and women who were victims of atrocities such as slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and colonialism. And I dare to believe that memory allows the work of history to remain alive and relevant, and perhaps to contribute to redress past wrongs. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you join me?
Sometimes I had the impression that I was hearing a noise, but I was not sure if it was coming from me. That I was trying to not move too fast, because sometimes I gesticulate and move when I'm talking.
Well, we were riveted by what you were saying, so whatever else was going on, we didn't notice it was I didn't. Well, thank you so much for that really engaging talk. And so we have about 15 minutes for questions. And I will get us started. Actually, I'm going to start with a question I asked you earlier when we did our podcast, and stay tuned for that coming in a few weeks, the broadcast of our interview. But can you talk about how you came to study the transatlantic slave trade, why that's important to you?
Well, I try to not do much rambling. Then I migrated from Brazil to Canada in 1999, and in Canada, as I took a distance from Brazil, and I was doing research then on European travel accounts, especially then French travel accounts in Brazil in the 19th century that largely depicted then indigenous populations and black populations in Brazil in slavery. And it is that with this distance that I took from the country where I was raised, that I realized that this history was not taught. And even if the black presence and black traditions, black religions, and black culture is present everywhere in a place like Brazil, then it's impossible that it's visible. But there was no official recognition of this importance at the time. Then in Brazil, there was no teaching of history of Africa until the 1990s in Brazilian universities, for you to have an idea. The teaching of history of slavery as well, and the populations of African descent. And it's when I took this distance that I realized that, and then I was doing at the time, I did a PhD in art history, and then I decided to do a PhD in, a second PhD in history, and to study how the slavery was memorialized in Brazil and West Africa, in a place that is called Republic of Benin, the former kingdom of Dahomey, the one that is featured in the movie with Viola Davis that was
Woman King.
Yeah, the Woman King.
Thank you. I wonder if there are questions from the audience. Yes.
Thank you. A question about memory and intersection. In connection with the indigenous people's slavery and the African slavery, there seems, in the little work I've done on it, much less memory, so to speak, artifact, other elements in the indigenous, on the indigenous side of things. How does that impact the intersection between historians trying to bring both those stories forward?
Then I would say there are two dimensions. There is the memory, and the memory in many cases is related to how to how big these populations, the descendant community is, sometimes also the political importance of the descendant community. In the case of Brazil, for example, it's clear that the black population is much more visible than the indigenous community. But I would say that this has an impact, and the impact is clear to diminish and even to deny the fact that there was enslaved indigenous peoples. They were the first to be enslaved when the Europeans landed in the Americas. And it's not only the memory of this, but also if you take in terms of the records, there are records, there are documents showing the enslavement of indigenous populations, including these European travel accounts, if you take them as available records. But historians, they have dismissed that. And this is a problem too, and probably I am part of that problem as well, because in my work, very often I have to remind myself that depending on the location I am looking at, there were indigenous people who were enslaved, and in some cases they were enslaved side by side with enslaved Africans. And for a long time, then this, of course, in the 17th century, perhaps in places like Brazil is more visible, but it continued up to the 19th century. There are more historians doing this kind of work now, but this is another imbalance that needs to be redressed.
Other questions? Yes, Lord.
Thank you for that very interesting analysis of these themes. I wanted to push a little more on the relation between history and memory, and you were citing some French historians, so I'm going to jump in on that. Pierre Nora very famously argued that there is an important distinction between history and memory. And the problem with memory is it's used for nationalism and distortion, for monuments, for narratives that efface uncomfortable historical facts. So, although historians can study the history of memory and take into account the way communities remember the past, isn't it important to sustain that distinction in a way that enables historians to tell people, say, in North Carolina, what really happened in North Carolina, and what monuments might mean? And then, related to that, I just want to mention the 1619 project, because I've been recommending this to so many teachers. But your narrative suggests that there's something flawed about the 1619 project, which is precisely that it remains very Americentric, North America-centric. It fails at the task you have proposed, which is to center the South Atlantic and Brazil. So it's still not adequate for what you're doing. So these are two questions I'd like you to say more about.
Yes. No, of course that as historians what we are doing, we are seeking to some extent a certain truth. It's imperfect, we can revise what we did from time to time. We are looking for evidence. Memory is not looking for evidence. When we are talking about memory, the evidence, what really happened, doesn't really matter. And I think that I keep in my work a difference, even though I navigate between a person who studies memory as a historian and as a person who does traditional history, just looking at traditional records. What I'm saying here is, then I think that the distinction is important, even if every time that we're trying to do this distinction, we are caught with some problems. The problem of the present, the problem of how we manipulate evidence as well, how we cannot avoid manipulating evidence depending on the context. Then this is one element. Then I think that I agree that there is a distinction, even if when we discuss the distinctions, it's difficult to grasp. Regarding this 1619 project, I see the project as an object of study. It's an object that has to do with memory. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, she is a journalist. She does not claim that what she's doing is history. That is a project to commemorate that year, that is 1619. Now, of course, that any commemoration can be welcome. The same problem could be raised with Juneteenth, for example. Why we have a national holiday that is Juneteenth and not some other holiday that would, for example, commemorate slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in the United States. But from my point of view of historian that does the South Atlantic world, the date 1619, yeah, it's a construction. It's a construction. There are other dates. There are constructions as well, and I think that we should talk also about that. But one can also tell you, yes, but this is here in the United States. Then we are not interested in what is happening in other places. And I could understand this, but in other places in the United States that are part of the United States today, there were enslaved people, Africans, arriving before 1619. Now, to go beyond, because my point here is not to criticize the project, because I'm not talking even about the project, I'm talking about the date. But the other element that I think that is important, her project was so well received that even in a place like Brazil, that has its own initiatives and has its legislation to teach the history of slavery and African history, there is a journalist in Brazil who took on the project and created a Brazilian 1619 project that is called Quirino Project. Quirino is an Afro-Brazilian intellectual that is not based on a date, but takes the mission of the project, which is to talk about the centrality of Black people in this country, and then you can do the same in places like Brazil. Then this is just my point. I think that we can take all these examples to debate this conversation about memory and history.
There's a question there, and then I'll see you next.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I just was at Howard yesterday and had a chance to take a picture of your office door.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to say that I think the stakes for me of memory have to do with how difficult it is in racial states in the hemisphere with being able to teach history. And so sometimes the only thing that people can have access to is, something that happens in the synagogue or the church or the mosque or in the Chinese community school on Saturday afternoons, and that becomes the place where people are able to pass on those historical dates and facts and objects, but also a certain kind of analytic about the significance of slavery. So on one hand, like I'm thinking about the AP African American Studies kind of controversy that happened, and in many of those schools, you can take an AP course in history in many, many parts of the world, right, or contemporary cultures in many, many parts of the world, but you could not take one that looked at some other places in the Americas. And so in some ways, it's like Blackness gets freighted with trying to address all of the history of slavery, all the history of colonialism, because none of the other placemaker historical accounts have to deal with that in the same kind of way. Presumably an AP European Studies would have to deal with genocide of the Holocaust, right? But other than that, that's just not the way that we communicate that. And honestly, as a scholar, I feel deeply accountable around that because it's our associations and our ways of preparing comprehensive examinations for students that make it impossible for them to like give us the analytic that they would have learned, at their progressive synagogue on, or at their Sabbath hall on Saturdays. Like, we don't give them the room to share that with us. Thank you again for the presentation.
Thank you. And I think that what you are bringing is really these other spaces where we are discussing history and memory and these past atrocities that are not only the school or the classroom, but on the other hand, of course, we need this history being taught, and we need this history being taught as American history. Then the history of slavery is not the history of black people. Then the history of Africa is not the history of slavery, and the history of slavery includes the history of all those who came to this continent and who enslaved indigenous populations and African populations. Then, and this is a problem. And it's a problem, I think, that of course happens elsewhere, but here in the US, for example, we see this problem when, for example, there is the National Museum of African American History and Culture that was created in DC. The tendency now is that the history of slavery is told there in that museum, or the history of African Americans is told there, but not as fully told in the National Museum of American History. Then there is this tendency of segregating these histories, the same way that when you go to visit a plantation, you only learn about the slavery if you take the slavery tour, but if you go to the mansion, you do not see, the history of the slavery is not addressed. And I think that we have to fight against the way that these histories are put in compartments like this.
So we're slightly over time. I do want to honor the person who had the question there. If you can ask your question quickly and get Dr. Araujo.
Thank you for being here. I just have a question related to, you talked about earlier in your speech about how all of these current phenomenons, or previous phenomenons in certain nations, like the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. specifically, or say Carnival in Brazil, are a result of the transatlantic slave trade in some way, or were shaped by the transatlantic slave trade existing. And then you also mentioned, well, you didn't mention Jim Crow specifically, but then you also mentioned the importance of expanding beyond this America-centric, U.S.-centric view of the slave trade, and looking at countries like Brazil and Latin America in order to better understand the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm wondering how you would suggest implementing that expanded view of the slave trade back into how we look at our memory of the slave trade in the United States.
Well, I think that there are many ways of connecting that. Then I think that the main way of doing that is just to acknowledge that all these movements, all these connections were happening at the same time. We know cases, then Lisa is here, then her wonderful book is one of the beautiful examples of how then enslaved people and freed people circulated even after the end of slavery, then back to Africa and to other spaces. Then we are living in this world that is interconnected. We saw when George Floyd was assassinated that there were protests everywhere, then from France to Portugal to Brazil and even in African countries. Then the same way that we are connected now, during that period, there was these connections were also going on. Then enslaved people that were enslaved here in the United States being brought to Cuba, traveling or freeing themselves and going to other places. And I think that there is then an effort that as teachers, for example, we can make to create these connections. And how, for example, you have a course that is titled African Diaspora. Then we are, of course, that tend sometimes to focus more on the United States, but we establish these connections. But I think that your generation that is the young generation, it's on your shoulders to do the next steps. And I would say that one of the next steps, and this is why we have an institute like this, is the importance of the humanities, the importance of studying languages, the importance of studying abroad. It's when you get this worldview that if you just get caught with Florida and North Carolina, you perhaps can miss the point. But this is, I think that is your generation. It's on your shoulders to achieve, to complete this task.